Oh, good evening and welcome to August 2025 Backyard Forestry. Tonight's presentation is Earthworm Invasion featuring Sam Reed, PhD. Sam is a postdoctoral fellow at the University of Minnesota Institute on the Environment. Sam is very passionate about protecting forests from climate change and associated disturbances, some of which we'll talk about tonight. And his goal is to support public and private partners in making informed land management decisions under certain climatic conditions. The NJFA, as most of you probably know, is a 501c3 organization. We advocate for all forests in New Jersey and support responsible, sustainable use and science-based forest management. We speak for the forests of New Jersey, as well as private landowners and public landowners. As a note, this presentation is provided for general informational purposes only and is not intended to constitute specific advice. We encourage landowners to consult with their own attorneys, accountants, foresters, and professionals for professional advice concerning their woodlands and otherwise. Just thought I'd bring you a brief legislative regulatory update, particularly for forest landowners. It's very important to stay current on these things. And we have had a very, very busy 2025, and particularly in the last couple of months. We have been actively opposing proposed legislation which would require cutting more trees and depleting forest resources just to achieve an increased minimum revenue level under the Farmland Assessment Act. So just so that everybody understands it, the Farmland Assessment Act has been the most effective forest conservation program in New Jersey. It impacts approximately 400,000 acres of woodlands. And if you know anything about Jersey, there are about 2 million acres of woodlands, about evenly split between public and private ownership. So that means about 40% of private lands are in the program and are being conserved under management plans. And there was recent legislation which sought to increase the minimum revenue level. And that would require people to cut more, and particularly smaller properties to deplete forest resources. And those who couldn't do that or wouldn't do that or didn't want to move over to what's called stewardship, they might be forced out of the program and their woodlands would go towards development, which would not be a good thing. So this month, the State Farmland Evaluation Committee, which if you watched last month's Backyard Forestry, you know what that is, held its annual meeting in Trenton to set what are called 2026 land productivity values. And those are the values that are used by assessors in farmland assessment. And they also were considering what they called income threshold adjustments, which is exactly that minimum revenue I was talking about earlier. And they also presented a to-be-implemented online filing portal for farmland assessment applications. At that meeting, the Forestry Association addressed the committee prior to their deliberations on matters impacting forestry, including what they called the income threshold adjustments and other matters. And then at the conclusion of that meeting, they reached certain decisions, which we will be sending out to our members over the next couple of weeks. I had originally planned on sending this out a little earlier, but I wanted to wait till the Farmland Evaluation Committee had met. So watch your email for that. And if you haven't joined the Forestry Association yet, please join us. You can find that at njforestry.org. And I've been doing an awful lot of reading in the last couple of weeks about earthworms because I wanted to be prepared for tonight's presentation. And I found out there was an awful lot written about earthworms, and ranging from legends and some fact, and things, a lot written on glacial impacts on native earthworm populations, invasive earthworm species, and I put that in quotes, the earthworm invasion, as we call tonight's presentation, and most importantly, how earthworms impact our forests, which Sam is going to tell us a lot about, and something called multiple disturbance theory, which Sam is also going to address. What's really interesting is that Sam took if you read all the literature, Sam took a truly novel approach. And he decided to unbundle certain assumptions that were being made about the mechanisms of earthworms and how they prosper or do not prosper, what incents them to prosper, and the linking of activities and events, specifically how deer and forest canopy, two subjects very near and dear to us, impact earthworm populations. So Sam will introduce us to earthworms, take us through the motivation for his work, the study which he led, and its findings. So without further ado, we present Earthworm Invasion with Sam Reed, PhD.
Cool. Thank you so much, Rich.
You're welcome.
Let me get things shared. Can you see my screen?
Yes, sir.
Okay. Wonderful. Cool. Uh, well, thank you all for having me tonight, and joining to talk about earthworms. But before we get into that, I wanted to take a step back and have everyone think about just, well, sorry, I got to introduce myself as well. I'm an ecologist, focused on northern forest biodiversity, climate adaptation, and disturbance, as we've already covered. And I'm very, very familiar with deer and worms and canopy gaps and all that stuff. I've spent a lot of time out in the field, and we'll get into some of the pictures of that as well.
Is that your
Um,
hand in the picture there, Sam?
it is. It is.
Okay.
Should be a hand model, huh?
Yeah.
Alrighty. So the first question I want to ask folks is why disturbance? Um, well, for one, there's a lot of disturbances around us. And in an ecological sense, disturbances are how we get really rapid ecological change for both good and for bad. You know, we have emerald ash borer, we have deer, we have fire, windstorms. But these are the disturbances that we're most familiar with. But in reality, across the entire planet, there's this huge, huge array of disturbances that occur. And a lot of them are becoming more frequent with climate change. Others we don't tend to think about as disturbances. Um, and others are directly caused by us. One disturbance that doesn't get a lot of airtime, but does really impact forests, for example, is war. War is a disturbance. And if you look up in this upper left-hand corner right here, you can see this squiggly line surrounded by green. Those are actually trenches from World War One in France, and nothing's growing there anymore other than grasses. There's no trees or anything there. So, there's all types of disturbances. These disturbances interact with one another. They lead to unexpected outcomes. I guess except for the Death Star over here on the right, which kind of has only one outcome, but they're really important in deciding like what our ecosystems look like, and in particular what our forest ecosystems look like. And as I said before, we expect a lot of disturbances to increase with climate change. We expect them to increase in frequency, in intensity, and in severity, regardless of whether we're heading towards a warm and wet future or potentially a warm and dry future. No matter what, we expect more disturbances. Um, and when we have more disturbances on the landscape, one thing that we start to see is that these disturbances can interact with one another. So one disturbance can potentially facilitate another. Two or three disturbances can occur on the landscape and lead to totally different outcomes than an individual one of those disturbances would. So for instance, one that a lot of foresters are familiar with is drought can facilitate insects in our forests. Windstorms can facilitate fire, and so on. So we expect these disturbance interactions to increase over time. Um, but we expect this, but we don't always have the best understanding of it quantitatively. Um, and we especially don't have a great understanding of this concept of linked disturbance. So one disturbance facilitating another. Like I mentioned before, drought facilitating insects, that's a linked disturbance. But there's smaller disturbances that occur on the landscape that really don't get studied in tandem all that much. And we don't look at how these more common disturbances can facilitate one another. So the three that we've already mentioned we're going to talk about today are canopy gaps from either tree death, harvesting, so on, windstorms, deer, which are extremely common throughout the eastern US, and then earthworms, which we'll get into a little bit more later. Um, and the question I wanted to answer throughout a lot of this is, can we use these connections between disturbances to potentially influence or slow down what some might call like uncontrollable disturbances? Things that, like invasive earthworms, once they're on the landscape, seemingly it's impossible to slow them down. Um, but before we get into that, let's talk about like what are invasive earthworms? Uh, and it might come as a bit of a surprise, but like most of the earthworms that are around us are both non-native and some are considered invasive. Um, and what we're seeing is that there's a collection of European earthworm species and Southeast Asian species. I believe they're from the Philippines. And those are your jumping worms, the Southeast Asian species. A lot of the results that we're focusing on today and our better understanding actually is around the European earthworms, which have been around for a lot longer. Certain earthworms were brought over by early settlers. But a lot of the reason we're focused on them now is with greater and greater human incursion into our forests and increased use of forests, which is a good thing. We're also seeing more earthworms. Um, and part of the reason why they're considered non-native is one, because they came from another place, but two, throughout this entire region, or a lot of it, uh, we were covered by a glacier. And earthworms just they simply can't survive under that. So actually, if you look at New Jersey, the top half of it, or not top half, but maybe top third, had a big old glacier over it, not that long ago. So this whole region doesn't really have any native earthworms. I will say the southern part of New Jersey does have what is considered native earthworms to the US. But we'll get into that a little. So, what do invasive earthworms do? Uh, for one, they destroy the duff layer. They're just extremely good at their jobs. They eat everything. They eat all of the leaf litter that is on the ground. And that leaf litter is really, really important to the forest because it holds a lot of nutrients. It supports mycorrhizal networks. Earthworms also eat mycorrhizae and different fungi. When they eat that duff layer, they can warm the soil. They can also change the hydrology. They can change uh, they're able to change like the compaction of the soil. They tend to increase compaction. Um, and along with that, there's certain species that just simply do not do very well under these conditions, particularly sugar maple, yellow birch, and black cherry, among a host of others. I mean, oak and hickory don't particularly like having earthworms either. Um, and there's a number of associations that earthworms have on uh, herbaceous and shrubby plants as well. So we see a lot of plants that are that I love, like Trillium and Harry Solomon's seal and so on, that tend to decrease with earthworm invasion. They just don't do well in that environment without a litter layer. And then unfortunately, there's a group of species that do extremely well with invasive earthworms, and that's a lot of invasive species. So we see that pen sedge, which is a big issue in Wisconsin. You can see in this photo right here that I took, there's just this lawn of sedge underneath a canopy of sugar maple. Buckthorn, not as big of an issue in New Jersey, but I know Japanese stiltgrass, Japanese barberry, and pretty sure honeysuckle is an issue in New Jersey as well. Those have all been shown to increase with earthworms as well. Um, and it's because they like warmer soil and they like they like a bare soil that they can take root in. And um, you don't have to just take my word for it. Old Chuck Darwin, he his last book was actually on earthworms, and it was the best-selling book that he ever wrote. And what he said was, it may be doubted that any other animals had played such an important part in the history of the world as these lowly organized creatures. Because no matter where you go in the world, earthworms are playing a role in determining what soils look like, for better or for worse. And one question that I get quite often is like, we've always been told that earthworms are good, right? But the reality is earthworms are good or bad depending on the context. European earthworms in your garden can lead to aeration. It can reduce that they can actually reduce compaction in that context. They can increase organic materials. They can be good for the crops that you're growing. Whereas in a forest context, you're getting that elimination of the duff layer. You can get warmer temperatures in the summer and colder temperatures in the winter. Simplification of those forest fungal webs. You get pretty strong reductions in soil fauna and other creatures that are in the soil with earthworms. You get buried seeds, which, yes, a lot of seeds need to be buried, but not as deep as earthworms will take them. We actually have videos of earthworms coming to the surface, grabbing seeds and burying them. Just crazy. You can get damaged roots and then loss of nutrients. And when we talk about invasive earthworms in New Jersey, they're present in every county. Although the species that are there might vary, there are invasive earthworms throughout New Jersey. They're likely to be most influential in New Jersey's like northern oak hickory stands, your pine barrens. Not a great environment for invasive earthworms, but are there native species there that seemingly have evolved to thrive in a sandy pine barren environment, which is cool. And that picture right there, that's not my hand. That is a picture of one of your native earthworms right in the middle. Along with that, this Kortev et al. 1999 took place they did that study in New Jersey and found relationships between earthworms, stiltgrass, and barberry in New Jersey. So there's some research that's going on there. The other question I get a lot is, what's up with jumping worms? And as of right now, jumping worms are the species of worms that are from Southeast Asia. And as of right now, they have a relatively limited spread throughout New Jersey and a lot of the country. A lot of the times the jumping worms seem to be dispersed around cities in urban areas, places where there's a lot of people. And jumping worms are actually bad for your gardens because they turn your soil into this like coffee grind like texture. And then even worse for forests because uh, forests are a lot it's hard to manage soils across an entire forest relative to a raised bed for a garden. And what they do, as I said, is they turn the soil into this like coffee ground like texture, which is real bad for plant roots, fungal webs, and it can leach nutrients and more. But this is a group of species that we have less understanding of. So if you might have questions on some of the ecological impacts of jumping worms and how it fits into some of the work that we're talking about tonight, sometimes we're not going to have answers on that front, but we're going to try. I also pulled some maps from iNaturalist and EdMaps showing jumping worms throughout the region. And it looks like there's a couple of counties that they're present in New Jersey, but the reality is most of like the citizens and folks that are taking pictures and reporting these earthworms are reporting them in their gardens. They're not reporting them in the middle of the forest, often where you don't have service. So this is probably pretty biased towards urban areas, but it is still interesting to know like where these guys are living. But there, as I said, there's big questions that we have around them. Like it's unclear where jumping worms are in the forests of New Jersey. We don't have that. I couldn't find that anywhere. Unclear how jumping worms are influencing invasive plants. How deer and tree harvesting might influence jumping worms, also unclear. and then potentially like some of the compounding effects between European earthworms and jumping worms. We don't know what happens when there's this combined effect of these species. Do they compete with each other? Do they occupy different horizons of the soil? To be determined. Okay, that was our little prelude on earthworms. Let's move into some more familiar territory, canopy gaps. Canopy gaps form with tree harvesting or death, and they are extremely important for forest succession because they increase resources like light on the forest floor and allow the next generation of trees to regrow. And then deer. Deer are they're the plague of most eastern temperate forests. They are overabundant and they basically eat everything. So as you can see, this is a picture from Michigan, I believe, up on the right. Deer walk on the ice, and that browse line that's right there, that's just where the deer can reach and eat up to. And then you see the exclosure on the bottom. Plenty of trees growing within the fencing, not too many trees growing outside. In fact, you see quite a bit of Pennsylvania sedge growing outside, which is potentially due to this relationship between deer and earthworms that we're going to get into. And deer can really indirectly change a lot of aspects of the forest. So it's not just them eating everything, but they've been known to change the soil. They can influence wildlife, all types of things. So how do these disturbances actually fit together? There's been a number of studies showing that canopy gaps can increase deer because you got tons of food that's growing because of the light that's hitting the forest floor. There's been a number of studies, although less established, that deer can increase earthworms. Mechanisms we'll get into later, but a lot of people think it's because deer just kind of poop everywhere, which favors earthworms. So we had this question of like, okay, so if we combine gaps in deer, do we get more earthworms? Do we get more earthworms underneath the canopy gap? And we'll get to that. So we use these two experiments in northern Wisconsin. They're delineated by these different stars. So I'm colorblind. So I think it's a green star is the Flambeau experiment. And then the managed old growth silviculture study is the yellowy orange star. And there's 3 sites for that one. And basically these experiments have basically the same structure where they put a bunch of different canopy gaps throughout the forest. And then they put deer fencing in and around the canopy gaps. And we call this a full factorial experiment where there's equal numbers of treatments for both the number of canopy gaps and deer exclosures. I guess that doesn't really matter all too much. What does matter is with moss, our experimental design is we have these 24-meter gaps, and we had earthworm sampling inside and outside of deer fencing that was located somewhere around these gaps. And I went in and spent an entire summer basically just sampling earthworms within deer fencing and underneath these canopy gaps. And boy, it was a tough summer, and we'll talk a little bit about that later. But a lot of rubus that likes to grow within those gaps, or raspberry, and that stuff hurts. And well, as you can see, these are kind of tiny deer exclosures within these gaps, but they're effective. You're able to see that sugar maple's growing within these little fences underneath the gap. And within the Flambeau experiment, or FE, it's kind of the opposite of what the moss experiment was. So within the Flambeau experiment, we had these canopy gaps, but they built giant deer exclosures around them. So 80 by 80 meter exclosures around canopy gaps. So it's kind of an inversion. Before we had deer exclosures inside of the canopy gaps. And in this experiment, we had deer exclosures that went around the entire harvested area. And similarly, we sampled earthworms within each of those gaps uh, and within fenced and unfenced areas. And here's some pictures. You might be wondering, like, how do you sample invasive earthworms? They gave us a big old Chevy Silverado with a giant water tanker on the back. And what we did was we carried 8 or 9 gallons of water into the forest, which is heavy, and you mix it with mustard, dump it on the ground, and the earthworms come shooting to the surface because it kind of burns their skin. But it is the approved scientific method of how we sample earthworms. And you can kind of see it right in the middle here, where there's this like ring in the middle, and we just dump the mustard water on the ground. And then we throw the earthworms that we sampled into some alcohol, and that preserves them. But that is a trick that you can do at home with your grandkids, or if you need worms in a pinch for when you're fishing. So what do we measure? We measured earthworm biomass and density. So we collected all these earthworms. I took them back to the lab. I think we captured like 5,000 earthworms or something like that. I identified every single one to species, which meant looking at all of them underneath a microscope and counting how many rings they had and looking at their coloration. I weighed them and I measured them like lengthwise. We also measured soil moisture and temperature. And then the basic thing to know is I was sampling earthworms inside and outside of fencing, underneath a canopy gap or underneath a closed canopy. So we have 4 treatments. There's, wow, inside of a fence, underneath a canopy gap, inside of a fence, underneath a closed canopy, outside of a fence, underneath a canopy gap, and outside of a fence under a closed canopy. Great. So what do we find? We found that outside of fencing, we got a 20% increase in earthworm biomass. So there's an increase in earthworms outside of fencing. So we think that deer are increasing the biomass and density of earthworms. That's not included on here. And then when we looked at closed versus open canopies, we got a 62% decrease in the mean from a closed canopy to when we have an open canopy. And I believe when both of these variables were combined, from a inside of the fence underneath an open canopy to outside of a fence under a closed canopy, you get I think it's like a 70% decrease in earthworms. So what that means is harvesting trees and fencing out deer can lead to the lowest amount of earthworms and the lowest density of earthworms. And then within the flambeau experiment, the one different thing here is, yes, it was a little bit of a different experimental design, but we were sampling earthworms over time here, which is something that no one in the world has actually done when it comes to like deer or canopy gaps. Earthworms, they measured earthworms within all of these stands in 2006 before the experiment was actually put up. So before any trees were harvested or the fencing was put up. And we were able to come back in 2019 and see how earthworms had changed within those areas, which is pretty cool. And what we found is that inside of fencing, so where there's no deer, we saw a 9% increase in earthworms over time, earthworm density. And we sampled in the exact same spots and with the exact same methodology. But when we were outside of fencing, we saw a 69% increase in earthworm density outside of fencing from 2006 to 2019. And that's kind of what you can see on the right. So on the x-axis down here, you have inside versus outside of a fence, and then you have earthworm density on the y-axis, and the yellow and green represent your year. So On the right, you can see in 2006, earthworm density was quite a bit lower than it was in 2019. So earthworms are increasing way more rapidly outside of fencing over time than inside of fencing in this experiment. So we have two different experiments basically telling us the same thing, where you're getting more earthworms outside of fencing, and that canopy gaps decrease earthworms. Because we also found that here, where underneath a closed canopy, you're getting the greatest amount of increase in earthworms as well. So furthest away from the canopy gap, you're getting the greatest amount of earthworms, whereas directly underneath the canopy gap, you're getting the least amount of earthworms, particularly over time. So here's a little schematic of what we're talking about. So in the upper left-hand corner, right up here, you have your little deer. It's a closed canopy, and you're getting the most earthworms. On the right, you have the deer fenced out. You get a slight decrease in earthworms, but because there's still that closed canopy, there's still quite a few. And then once you open up the canopy, you still have deer. There's some earthworms, but when there's an open canopy plus deer are fenced out, you tend to get the least amount of earthworms with the lowest biomass. So why is this interesting? Well, for one, I mean, kind of crazy that we found this association in two different experiments. And I don't know. I had folks telling me, I don't think you're going to find anything. But we did, because, the science kind of guided us there. We had good hypotheses. And along with that, like, it's kind of leading us to, a real management solution to earthworms. Like, we found that harvesting trees and excluding deer led to the fewest earthworms. That's a win-win-win. So this is the question that always comes up, but I would prefer we answer it together. So I'm going to ask, how could deer and gaps influence invasive earthworms? And what I encourage you to do is scan this QR code that's on the screen, or go to menti.com and enter the code below. And it's all right if you don't want to do it, that's fine. But put in your answer for how these two disturbances might influence earthworms, and we'll see what I came up with and see how they compare. I'll pull it up right now, and I'll give everyone a minute to put in their answers. And once you answer, you should be able to.
And if they can't, they can just drop it in the chat. That
That
would
too?
be okay. That too. So could you restate that question?
Yeah.
Yeah.
So how might deer and canopy gaps influence earthworms? Why might deer increase earthworms? Why might gaps decrease earthworms? Okay. All righty. We have some answers rolling in. I'm pulling it up on my phone. What do we see? Deer eat vegetation that worms need. Oh, it went away. The soil in the gaps might be warmer, changes in root development, heated soil, hooves, so deer potentially breaking up the leaf litter and influencing the worm's food. Warming soil could potentially increase deer manure. Less organic matter from deer excrement in areas where they're excluded. Deer reduce woody vegetation, leaving more grassy vegetation, which could provide better food quality for earthworms. All great answers. Let's see what I came up with, or what my team came up with. So it's possible that when deer are eating what's above ground, plants could be moving nutrients and growth into their roots, which could favor earthworms, which are operating on the surface and below ground. Deer could break up litter with their hooves, which could make it easier for earthworms to eat. Or they could increase nutrients through their waste. So this little schematic on the right shows all the different ways that above ground herbivory might impact below ground species like earthworms. And there's a lot of different ways. Um, what is likely happening with canopy gaps is you're likely getting a decrease in the amount of high quality litter. You're often um, decreasing the number of overstory trees, so that you're getting, shrubby litter. And then you can get dried out litter uh, within a canopy gap because there is more sunlight that is hitting the ground, albeit the water table and what the soil moisture that's occurring within a canopy gap uh, can actually increase with harvesting trees. But the amount of sunlight that's hitting that litter, that leaf litter, can dry it out. Um, but these are inconclusive. We couldn't test these. These are just our hypotheses. So why is this important? Kind of hinted at it earlier. These changes in earthworms could influence forest health. We could see increases in desirable species like sugar maple with decreases in earthworms. And of course, decreases with deer as well. Um, and by manipulating these disturbance links, it could help us control something, or at least pump the brakes on earthworm invasion. Um, Along with that, why is this important? Using these disturbance links could head off future issues within forests. So invasives, we know that there's a connection between earthworms and invasive plants. So if we are reducing the amount of deer in an area, we might inadvertently be reducing the amount of invasive plants that are there as well. Both because deer tend to not like eating invasive plant species, but also they're not increasing the amount of earthworms that are there and changing the soil environment, which tends to be favorable for invasive plants. And then it's possible that deer and canopy gaps are connected to jumping worms as well, but we don't know that yet. Everything that we studied for this experiment was European earthworms. But there might be a connection between deer and jumping worms or harvesting trees and jumping worms. We're just not sure yet. So, big picture, people are already thinking about how disturbances are linked with one another. This is just kind of a new way of approaching it. People already think about how windstorms or ice storms can lead to more fuel for fires. That's why we salvage log on occasion. We know that and drought and less water within a stand can lead to greater insect pests. That's why we harvest trees so that there's uh, less water reliance within the forest. And inadvertently, that reduces your insect pests. So, this is another link that might be useful for us. By fencing out deer and harvesting some trees, we might be able to reduce the amount of earthworms. But with that, like the best strategy here is to prevent worms is to prevent like their introduction. Um, don't dump out your worms when you're fishing in the forest. Throw them away. They'll be happy at the dump. Um, Along with that, uh, for when it comes to like jumping worms, check the mulch that you're using, check the soil that you're using to see if there's those quick moving worms that are jumping around before you plant them, especially if you're thinking of planting them before you spread mulch or soil in a forested environment or something like that. Um, I also just wanted to highlight some of what's upcoming on my end that folks might be interested in. Um, you know, these are a couple of the papers that I have that are coming out soon that might be interesting to some of the foresters in the room. One thing that I did, that my big project from my postdoc that I didn't talk about today, is I reviewed every single Northeast and Midwest states' forest action plans, including New Jersey's, which was like 3,500 pages of reading. And I extracted and summarized all of the different disturbance management strategies from those so that we can learn from states and what they're doing. I also have a paper that'll be coming out soon on the different climate-assisted migration planting trials that are going on throughout the Midwest, along with some of their characteristics. So, like what density and species are being planted throughout Michigan, Wisconsin, and Minnesota. And there's some crazy species that are getting planted, and we got to know about what people are trying. I know there's someone planting bald cypress in Wisconsin or maybe Minnesota. So all types of things happening. Testing the frost tolerance of some of the climate adapted tree plantings that are being put in the ground to replace ash, because that's a big concern, especially in the northern Midwest. When it comes to like how earthworms, deer, and canopy gaps actually influence vegetation, we're able to look at that and how sugar maple regeneration has changed over 15 years in those woods. I just haven't gotten around to publishing that yet. We're looking at how oak wilt influences forest biodiversity. And then one thing that folks should know about is the Forest Service is doing a climate vulnerability assessment for everywhere in Region 9, which includes New Jersey. That's everywhere from Minnesota to Maine and down to Missouri. And you'll have a climate vulnerability assessment coming out hopefully in the near future. And I'm on that for Northeast Minnesota. So I keep an eye out. But, oh, I already said that. I did want to show one little snippet of data from my state forest action plan work that ties into what we talked about. I collected all the different like disturbance theories that I thought were particularly important, which linked disturbance is one that I obviously find to be pretty important. And there's a lot of mentions of disturbance linkages throughout these plans. Although they might not use the term, they're folks, when they're writing these planning documents, are thinking about how one disturbance facilitates another. And we see that throughout. So this is 117 separate instances of linked disturbance coming up across all of these plans, which people might not expect to see. So more to come. If you want to reach out, you want to hire me, looking for a job right now. If you have any questions or you want to chat about some of my disturbance papers, my information's all here. And I am happy to answer some questions.
Well, we have a bunch in the chat. A
Okay.
lot of references to people seeing jumping worms on their properties throughout the state.
Mm,
So it's quite extensive. If you went back and looked through the list, you would see that little map that you had really is an understatement of where they're present.
yeah. Yeah, that is not surprising. It's you know, we're limited in our knowledge and we can only know what people report.
So many times in past backyard forestries, one question came up a lot was about that. Are worms a sign of forest health? And people ask that, and I think they still assume that. But having read a bunch of literature, as I say, in preparation for this meeting, it's pretty clear that from an agricultural or planting side, there's one view of earthworms, and from the forest side, there's an entirely different view. And I think that for a long time, earthworms were looked at positively in both environments.
Yeah.
And I think that led to a lot of people almost welcoming them and not worrying about the soil. I see someone put up a post in the chat about being very careful with plant transfers and washing roots to make sure that
Mm,
they're not in there. I thought your point about the mulch was very good. I'm just going to go over and scan the questions that we received. I'll ask you a question about earthworms. that everybody usually gets right who knows something about earthworms, but people believe that if you cut them, they will grow into two earthworms. Cut them in half. And that is true or not true? Not true.
Depends.
Not,
It
well,
depends. It
okay.
depends. So
Forester's
actually
answer.
the trick with jumping worms is okay, so you might not be able to cut them in half, but they don't need a partner to reproduce. They are able to bud. They are able to clone themselves and spread, which is kind of crazy. And almost worse.
Hmm. And so I did read some questions on cocoons and their ability to sort of lay as almost seeds in a seed bank.
Yep.
Could you talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, so I mean, well, I mean, they're basically able to reproduce by they have eggs that they're able to drop into the ground. And those eggs are extremely drought tolerant from what I've read. And they can survive through a lot. And they are also transportable. So in some ways it's a wicked problem in that like you can't control that. But what you can control is spreading the actual adults.
So in general terms, they're here to stay.
Hmm.
And so,
Yep.
some of the literature said you better get used to it.
Yeah.
And and I did see some methods, treatments being proffered. One referenced mustard, like you had mentioned, to bring them to the surface, but then that would involve culling them from the earth and doing
Yeah.
something with them.
So I think the issue with a lot of treatments is like, with any type of shrubby plant like buckthorn or honeysuckle, you can cut them and apply some herbicide, and hopefully that kills them. But applying some type of pesticide to kill earthworms will also likely kill all the other soil biota. So you run into that issue as well. But honestly, my approach to invasives is they are pretty much all here to stay. Um, Unfortunately. And I think that we do both have to live with them, but as everyone knows, we just have to be careful with them because we can slow their spread.
Is there any correlation that you found between insect presence in high numbers and earthworms?
Hmm.
There were a
So the
couple of
question is
questions.
like, um, yeah, I haven't seen anything on that.
Nothing. Yeah, I didn't, I saw references to it, thoughts about it, and I see some questions about it, but I didn't find anything either on that, and I was curious whether there was any connection. I'm trying to see. Has anyone looked at earthworms as a source of food for
Hmm.
humans?
No, I don't. I maybe. I don't think that would sell particularly well. They're I doubt they're particularly high protein in the long run either. So there's not much of a win there.
Mhm.
But birds love them. But a lot of people tend to have questions on birds. Um, Robins will eat them, but there are some studies showing that ground nesting birds, which depend on that duff layer, can actually decrease with invasive earthworms as well.
That makes sense.
Um, so that's another interesting connection of how
Well,
they.
the open canopy also contributes to bird populations,
Yep,
so that could be another contributing factor.
yep,
Right.
yep. So I think these things are connected in all types of ways. I see someone said their brother encouraged them to eat an earthworm on a dare, said it was tasty.
I see that.
I'm gonna call BS on that, but okay.
I don't know. I've seen a lot of things eaten around campfires and a couple of
It's true.
beers. They will cause people to eat those things. And it does happen. So
Yeah.
I'm not going to call it on that one. I think that's real. There was a question here on overpopulation. Are there peak years of earthworms? Are there cycles like cicadas?
Mm. So we don't have like 17-year earthworm outbreaks like we do with cicadas. But yes, there are high years and low years. So drought and drier conditions can reduce earthworms. Um, so yeah, drier conditions tend to do that. I'll also say that there is a seasonal component to it. So like a lot of earthworms don't reach maturity where they can reproduce until around fall. Uh, it takes a full growing season for a lot of these earthworms to be able to reproduce.
Now, I know you had
It,
mentioned your interest in changing climatic conditions. And so, how does increasing temperature affect earthworm populations?
yeah. Um, so
Or
I just
maybe
want
I
to
should
be,
say decreasing frost periods as opposed to
yeah.
increasing temperature.
Yeah. So, I just want to be clear on a couple of things. You know, we we are not with climate change, we are not seeing increased earthworm spread in the Midwest because they're able to survive basically everywhere already. But we do see increasing earthworm spread actually in permafrost now, up in the high Canadian Arctic, where earthworms are able to survive in that region with climate change. So there's one connection. When it comes to warmer temperatures with climate change, if we're heading towards a warmer and wetter future, that would likely benefit earthworms. Whereas a warmer and drier future probably wouldn't, at least where earthworms already are.
Now, how long do earthworms live?
I think it's like 2 to 3 years.
Okay, so they're not great pets, but okay.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, if you want to, I had an earthworm farm when I was a kid, which it stunk. That was why my parents got rid of it. I think they only lived 2 or 3 years.
I find, and I think this is probably one of the most interesting questions, which I think goes to your starting point in this, is how do you get rid of the invasive species and bring back the good? And I think that is the whole like misconception of good earthworms in a forest. And this idea that permeates, still's out there every day that people will say, oh, I have lots of worms, it must be healthy. And
Yeah. So, I mean, almost all of these forests evolved without earthworms, and these soils took thousands of years to form without earthworms. So, how do you get it back to the good is you can't. Um, they're there for good. Um, so it's a question of living with them and how do we adapt to them and not spread them any more than we already are.
Here, question came up on biochar. We talked about that before we kicked off. Uh, any thoughts on that? This,
Yeah, I sent my advisor an email and I was like, man, I just like there's a lot of thought that goes into biochar on all types of things. And what we agreed on is that there's a couple studies showing that very, very high amounts of biochar can reduce earthworms. But there are no studies to our knowledge that show that increased biochar leads to any meaningful ecological benefit as it relates to earthworms. Um, there are very, very clear indicators of earthworm presence in a forest when it comes to like how the vegetation is doing and the duff layer. But there are almost no studies that look at like how biochar additions might benefit those really important ecological components. So, yeah, I don't know. I'm not sold on it.
Okay. What about, and if you thought at all about, this is a great question. How does controlled burn impact earthworms? The questions come up all the time on invasives. And whenever we speak on prescribed burn,
Yeah,
question of how does it affect invasives? How does it affect this type of tree? How does it affect this type of plant, these animals? And in most animal cases, the position is the animals leave when it's burning and come back when it's over. I
yeah.
don't, I haven't read anything on earthworm studies,
Yeah, there's very little on it.
but
You know,
we should
I
remember that controlled burn is low temperature burn, not high
yeah,
temperature burn.
yep. Yeah, so I mean, it is a low temperature burn. So in all likelihood, they are just burrowing. It's not going to kill them directly. But there's a chance that if you're burning up some of the leaf litter and returning those nutrients to the soil, they might not be able to consume them, which might lead to at least slower population growth. But I don't think it could
How deep
eliminate
do the
them.
eggs, how deep are the eggs in the layer?
It depends on the species. Well, so the eggs, I'm not sure, but the species, certain species, like the night crawlers that you saw in my hand in that picture, they can burrow like I think it's like 3, 4 feet.
So,
So they can
sort of
get
like a
really
sequel to
deep.
Dune or something like that.
Yeah, yeah, they can get really, really deep. Um, so yeah, it really depends.
So it looks like they're going to probably survive that control burn situation.
Oh, almost certainly. But, do it anyway. There, I am a big, big prescribed fire advocate.
Yeah. So any other questions from anyone? Want to drop them in the chat?
Hmm. Any natural predators besides birds? It's a really good question. Um, I'm I I'm not sure. I don't think so.
Yeah, I thought there was another interesting comment was the idea that a balanced, healthy, diverse environment might create a balance in the earthworm population. So that, there's a lot to be looked at, but this is
hmm
clearly a pressing issue. You see the reaction of everybody having these in their woods, in their home, around their homes. Um, some of them even invade foundations
Hmm.
of homes. There are reports of that.
I believe
And
that.
yeah, so it's quite an aggressive situation, and really glad we got to get it out there in the open and talk about it. I'm just going to see, I see a couple of things in the Q&A here. I want to see if something came up. That
Oh,
was about eating
there's a
them. Do birds eat
what?
them? And why do I see them all over my paved driveway? Usually you see them after it rains. Um, and
Oh yeah,
okay,
yeah. Well, okay, so there's a bunch of comments in the chat
yeah.
on how moles and shrews might be predators, frogs, so on. Great questions or great ideas. Yes, I could see all of that being possible. Susan asks a phenomenal question on whether Carex pennsylvanica comes with worms, which is that's Pennsylvania sedge, which is a huge competing species with sugar maple in Wisconsin. Really big issue. I don't. I Part of the reason why I think that Pennsylvania sedge and sedgy species, grassy species, do really well with earthworms is because they're simplifying the soil structure, and a lot of times they're drying out the soil. And that leads to really good conditions for something like Pennsylvania sedge, and not particularly good conditions for uh, something like sugar maple.
Okay, well, are there any thoughts you want to leave the group with, Sam?
Hmm. No, thank you all. Throw your earthworms away. Um, and I thank you all for the work you're doing. Keep taking care of your forests.
Well, I thank you so much for sharing this with us. I think the food for thought that I see here is to try to think about how multiple things can affect a single outcome that we're trying to achieve. So not to think in terms so much as a single action to be taken, but a combination of actions to be taken, which may result in some degree of management. So thank you. Thank you
Yeah,
so
that's
much.
spot on. Cool. Thank y'all.
Okay, we'll see you soon. Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you everyone for attending.